Welcome everyone. Sorry for the delay. We're running a little late today, about 24 minutes. I'm sincerely sorry about this slight issue. So today it's our pleasure to host Professor Josh Levine, who is an associate professor at the University of Arizona. And before that, Josh was an assistant professor at Clemson University in South Carolina. And before that, he was a postdoc researcher at the Ski Institute at the University of Utah. And Josh is the recipient of the DOE Career Award. Was in 2019.
2019, 2018, something like that. Why I forget.
And Josh is an expert in data visualization, geometric modeling, and topological methods for all of the above.
Yeah.
So without further ado, Josh, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Julian, for the great introduction. I know this is a group of people who all do topological data analysis. I'm not going to talk about any of that today. Sorry, I apologize. I'm going to talk about another topic that's in volume visualization and scientific visualization. Julian and I chatted a little bit about what folks might find interesting, and he thought maybe talking a little bit about some of the work that I do on neural representations and using neural networks in volume viz might be interesting to talk about. So I tried to start these talks with. I try to start these talks with kind of just some high-level questions, just so folks can be on the same page. So I'm going to try to answer who, where, why, and what, and then we'll get to all the technical details. So for the who, the work is actually with a collection of longtime collaborators of mine. In particular, there's going to be two parts to my talk. The first part is with one of my PhD students, Jishin Lee, and a longtime collaborator of mine, Matt Berger. Matt is now faculty at Vanderbilt, but he was also someone who went to the University of Utah as a PhD student. Matt and Julian and I were all there at the same time, actually. And then the second part of the work is with one of Matt's students, an undergraduate named Brian Liu, and then a different PhD student of mine, Kairon Jiang. So that's kind of the who. Here's a little bit of the where. Folks probably haven't been to Arizona before, unless you were there for Viz 2018, I think was in Phoenix, right? It was 2018. But that's where I live. It's Tucson, Arizona. It's in one of the southern or southwestern parts of the United States. Here's a little bit of what campus looks like. So the computer science department is this tall building up here. It's, I think, the tallest building on campus. Just coincidentally, it's not because computer science is treated any more specially there. If anything, it's actually not the big thing at University of Arizona. We do a lot of work on optical sciences. So a lot of the satellites that are out there and the telescopes that are being made, the manufacturing of the mirrors in those telescopes actually happens at the university. It happens under the football stadium, which is kind of over here. There's a huge oven underneath that actually cooks glass and then spins to create this kind of parabolic mirror shape. It's pretty neat to go see. It's very, very hot in the desert where we live in Tucson. The average temperature in June and July is about 40 degrees Celsius. And I look today, it's 41 degrees Celsius today. So a cool day for us. And we get about 10 inches of rain per year. So it is really hot and dry there, but it's beautiful, it's gorgeous. If you all have the chance to come visit, I definitely suggest that you spend time in the outdoors while you're there. So I'm from Tucson, but not originally. I actually grew up on the eastern side of the country in Ohio. I went to school at Ohio State. I went to my undergraduate at Case Western. Cleveland, Ohio is kind of where I am from. That's where Case Western is. So that's a little bit of the where. The why, I hope I don't have to motivate too much with this group, but I'm going to talk today about scalar field visualization. Here for me, scalar field is a very simple model. I have some manifold M. At every position, I have some scalar value. And I can use this to model all sorts of scientific data, whether that be things like temperature over the surface of the Earth, concentration of water in cells, and things like medical images that talk about responses. And you can do all sorts of interesting things with this sort of data. We've been studying how to use scalar field data in the Viz community for 30 to 40 years, if you really go back and look at the history of this work. And today I'm going to kind of build on a lot of those techniques just to motivate some of the cool things that we can do with it. Here's some pictures of volume viz, totally taken from a bunch of different other authors' websites. Some of these volumes you may recognize, this field data set, a lot of people starting out in viz play around with when they start with them. This is actually the result of doing different visualization techniques to present all this data. Right, that's the who, the where, and the why, literally in 2 minutes or less. Now I'm going to spend time talking about the what. And I'm going to talk about two different projects. The first project is a couple years old. It's a project that Matt and my student Jishin worked on that's a generative model for volume rendering. So I think this group probably knows a little bit about volume rendering, but I'll review it for the benefit of Amy and Otis. Volume rendering, the way it works is you start out with a 3D volume, and you basically are trying to generate images of that volume going through. So these are 2D down here and 3D up here. And what you do is you cast rays into the volume. So this is kind of your volume rendering sort of integral. And what you do is you accumulate how those rays travel through the volume as modulated by an opacity and a color transfer function. So the basic idea is you start to try to generate pictures, and then you rotate cameras around and use 3D volumes with that. Anyone who used ParaView has used a volume render before, it kind of is all built in. What we're really studying in this project is what happens when you think about how the user controls work. And can we use neural networks to help understand the space of possible things you can do? So here for me, when I say user controls, I mean, you can set the viewpoint by rotating the camera around. You can set that opacity transfer function. You can set those color transfer functions. So those are all items that the user gets to interact with. And it's actually quite a large parameter space to explore when you're looking through and trying to do a volume rendering. I tend to think volume rendering, if you spent a little bit of time with it, you can become quite good with it. But if you're a total novice, you kind of have no idea how to set these parameters, except for maybe the camera. It's kind of natural to rotate around 3D, but the opacity and color transfer function still are kind of, opaque. So that's kind of the challenges that this work starts out with. Basically, we want to try to tell the user different ways to manipulate the controls and give them some guidance. What happens if I change the input parameter in one way? How will the output image look? And then can we actually provide some kind of overview of all those things? There's lots of related work, by the way, in this viz. So this slide is kind of breeze through some related work. Basically, there's kind of two camps of related work. The first is work that kind of tells the user, here's an edit, and give you a little bit of guidance in different ways. The most basic form of this that lots of people are familiar with is I'll show a histogram of the data values, and then I can set the transfer function based on the histogram. There's also work that shows volume overviews. The work on the right is trying to do a kind of graph-based model to show you a little bit about what you could do if you manipulate through this. There's been a variety of work on this. I don't have time to cover all of it, unfortunately, but I kind of think it's helpful to think about these as these two kind of separate challenges. All right, so for us to do a neural model here, what I'm going to spend a little bit of time is thinking about that process of process of volume rendering. And again, we have these inputs. We have our volume, we have our viewpoint, we have our opacity, and our color transfer function. And essentially what we do when we render is we basically solve the volume rendering integral for every pixel in the image. We cast array, do that integration, and we spit out an image. This, if you look at the works that I just told you about with the related work, typically what happens is when they're doing analysis, they do it somewhere in this input space. And the problem with this, I argue in this work is, or we argue in this work, is that if you do the analysis only in this input space, you are decoupled from basically the final image that you get produced. You're only really studying something about the data fundamentally, or about something like the space of transfer functions. So what we're going to do in this work is we're going to play a different game. We're going to do the analysis at the volume rendering interval step. So we're going to take that box and we're going to do some analysis there. The way we're going to do it, which is kind of intriguing and interesting as an idea, is we ask the following question. Can I take the volume rendering integral and replace it with a neural network? And in fact, that's the trick in this work, which is basically we built a neural network that, given the input parameters, spits out images for us. And this is a particular type of neural network. I'm saying it's a generative model. If you know anything about GANs or generative adversarial networks, that's the type of network we're using here. And basically, we're asking the question of, can we do that, first of all? And then secondarily, if we do it, and if it's successful, can we actually analyze the volume rendering process? And we argue, yes, you can do at least a little bit of that. There's been a little bit of work after this. So this paper I sent it at was a couple years old. There's been a number of follow-up papers from various authors that have kind of showed, oh yeah, you can actually do lots of interesting things with this. What's happening here is we're basically doing analysis by synthesis. If you look at the computer vision community, there's quite a lot of work on this in different ways, and they fall into different computer vision sort of tasks. So one of those sorts of tasks is image inpainting, where you say, can I take the sample of pixels around some image and fill in the blanks of some missing region? Maybe you have something that's occluding this and you want to then repair it by removing that object in the foreground. Or can I do things like colorize an image? Again, can I take partial image, do some analysis, and then actually synthesize something new from it? And that's exactly where we're kind of falling into that camp. This paper could have in some sense been a computer vision paper, but I don't think the computer vision community was ready to look at volume rendering in close ways. I also, by the way, here's now a little side story. I don't think the Viz community, when we submitted this paper, was ready to read a paper about neural networks. They actually looked at the paper initially and they said, why would you ever do this? This is a waste of time, that sort of thing. So we had some really bad negative reviews. And as many of you know, when you submit papers, sometimes you flip those around and it becomes a really interesting paper. All right, I'm going to go into some details of the network architecture, just so you can see a little bit about how that is. I'm not going to dig too far into it though. So at this stage, I feel like I'm fairly confident about neural networks. When I first started this work, I kind of said it's still magic and let's focus on the viz bits. But if you have questions, just stop and we can interrupt. So here's how the network is set up. Basically, we start out with a collection of pairs. We have inputs, which are here, viewpoints and transfer functions, and we have output images, and we generate a big corpus of these. When I say big, I mean a couple 100,000 pairs. And there's some interesting questions of like, how do you sample the space of transfer functions? Sampling the space of viewpoints is maybe not so bad. You're kind of sampling on a sphere and you're kind of moving it out. But sampling the space of transfer functions is kind of gnarly. And we had some schemes for doing it. I wouldn't say they're the best, but they worked okay for us. And then we built a generative model. So a generative model here is actually two different neural networks that work together. The first is a neural network that's called the generator. I'm going to represent it with this trapezoid. It literally takes its input, viewpoint, and transfer function, and it's designed to spit out image. And when I say it takes as input these things, we're going to vectorize all these inputs, and I'll show you a little bit and unpack that for you, but it's basically that all goes in and it spits out. You can think of this literally as a function of viewpoint and transfer function that spits out or returns an image. The second half of the GAN is a discriminator. A discriminator network is more like a classification network in neural networks. It takes as input now, viewpoint, transfer function, and an image, and it asks the question, is this truly the image? Is it real? Or is it a fake? Am I trying to trick the network in some way? So this neural network literally just returns a bit. It says either thumbs up, it's real, thumbs down, it's fake. And so what you do when you train these two networks is you actually jointly optimize them. What you do is you start out and you basically say, let's get the discriminator really good at distinguishing real from fake. So we show it a bunch of things from our initial corpus, and it starts to learn real from fake, and in particular, it starts to learn what's real. So once it gets updated, it gets very good at detecting these are the sorts of images I would expect to see from here. And then we use that to basically take the output of the generator, feed it into the discriminator, and from there, we start to train this so that it says, oh, the generator is trying to fake images. So actually we give it a little bit of nudge that basically says, oh, the generator is not doing a good job yet. As the generator does better at learning the mapping from input space to images, the discriminator then will get worse and worse at being able to detect, is this the real image or is it a fake image? And these things go back and forth. So we try to fool the discriminator, we then show fake images, and kind of go back and forth, and you can see this kind of testing going through. So what happens is these two things optimize at the same time. And if you look at the literature on GANs, it's kind of tricky to do the optimization. I think the huge amount of work in this paper was spent on, can we actually optimize this stuff at all? Because what's happening is you kind of are, they're playing a game against each other and you end up on this kind of ridge. If you look at the optimization space where you're kind of nudging between them and you hope that you land on the best point to that ridge, but often you fall to one side and the generator gets really good or the discriminator gets really good and it causes the other one just to fail miserably. So there's a lot of tuning that goes into that. Question?
Do you want us to ask questions after or do?
Go ahead, either way, yeah.
Just a very simple question first to get it out of the way. Here on this picture, you show the same data set.
Mhm.
Were you training on the same data set or were you training on multiple data sets? Or?
Yeah, by data set here, you mean volume, right?
Oh, volume.
Yeah, so this is a technique that works for one volume. We build the GAN network for one volume at a time, and it only learns volume. So
That makes perfect sense.
well, and there's an interesting follow-up question is, can you generalize across volumes? I think that's much, much harder because you'd be basically saying, do a collection of volumes all return similar images for similar input parameters? But there's a middle ground there that is interesting. What if you were working with an ensemble of data where you have a progression of simulation time steps, where you expect the simulation to slowly evolve? If you look at one of the follow papers of this work called In Situ Net, they actually do think about this with different parameters in an ensemble.
And I had a second question when you were talking of the training of the discriminator. Do you feed fake images to the discriminator with a, so how does it work? Do you get only true images or?
What happens is, so the generator to start out with, I know you're asking about the discriminator, the generator to start out with, it produces noise when you give it the input space. It doesn't produce good quality images because it's trying to learn the pairwise mapping between. So we feed it the images from the generator, and then this actually back propagates through the network to update the generator. So the discriminator really only learns from the corpus of images that we sample it from, but the generator is fed into that next. So there's kind of a little bit of oscillation between those.
But you do have to give it some real images to start.
The discriminator gets access to the real corpus. Actually, both networks get access to the real corpus, but in different ways in terms of how they optimize. I'm going to do this on my slide because I think it's going to answer your follow-up question, which there's tons of details in the paper about training. So I think it's interesting to think about, but to me, like the novelty of the work is not exactly how we chose to train it. The novelty of the work here is that we could. So in some sense, when I talk about this stuff, I kind of like move away from the neural network details. Yeah. Any other questions though about kind of broadly how the network works? Yeah. Sure. Mm-hmm. It's not random in the sense of these things are synced together. This input gets fed with this one, but which set we sample from in that corpus of 100,000, yeah, we randomly set sample batches from there. Yeah, I think we tried a couple different structured ways of doing it. It's been a couple of years since I looked at the exact details here, but we probably did this in batches where we made sure that in a full epoch of training, the generator got to see the whole corpus of data, but the order that it saw it in was probably randomized. Yeah.
So in this set, you have visualization
Yeah, this is where I hinted at the, like, how do you pick transfer functions? Because there's some of these transfer functions are garbage, right? If I set the transfer function with high opacity here, right, you get a full cube and you get nothing to see along the way. Yep, those go in. I mean, in some sense, we weren't trying to only generate volume rendered images that we're interested in. We just said generate all of them, right? But there's some tuning that has to go into that because you can easily bias this sample. And you can imagine it's very easy to generate a bunch of bad volumes and you can kind of enumerate that. The way we sampled the opacity transfer functions, we basically sampled them as a Gaussian mixture model so that we kind of skewed away from just totally random transfer functions. These would be a little bit more like realistic ones. Yeah. Okay. Do you guys want to see some results?
Yeah,
all right, cool. So I'm going to show the results in a couple different ways. The first result here is just some pairs of images between the ground truth and the synthesized images. So basically, these are original. These are what our network spits out for the input parameters. Again, these are original. These are what the network spits out. The projector's not doing a great job, I would say, because on the projector, I think they look really good. On my screen, they look slightly less good. So just understand there's extra detail here, but I'll highlight a couple for you. So here you can actually see some deviation between those two. And this is the sort of thing our GAN produces. You get kind of modulations in color shift or modulations in kind of some of the surfaces. This one's a little bit harder to see, but here there's a different color reproduction on the chin. This is supposed to be kind of white, and here you'll actually see a little bit of a range of color. But it's pretty good, right? I have to admit, when Matt walked into my office and he said, I think we can do this, I told him, no way, this isn't gonna work at all. And I was very surprised and very much pleasantly surprised. I was like, okay, wow, maybe we have an interesting idea here. Here's a comparison of, this is VTK's volume render, and we use VTK to just sample it. So you could argue, oh, well, what if you wanted a much more sophisticated render like Osprey that's doing crazy, you know, ambient occlusion and things like that. So here's the VTK renderer. Here's our generative model. And we set them up side by side so that they will both respond to this transfer function and to the viewpoint. And here's a little video of them animating. And because the way the generator works, it just can batch pass in the parameters and spit out an image. Our generative model is very, very fast. So you think about it in some sense, because it's learned the space of images, this is very, very interactive to work with. In this case, because we're using a small image, it's equally interactive to the VTK renderer.
Actually, I can see on the screen.
Yeah.
And it's funny how it interpolates rotation.
Oh, the Zoom screen interpolating it? Or are you saying the render interpolating?
Generative model.
Yeah, there's a little bit of kind of, it almost looks like a dream somehow. It's like fuzzy, like a dream. And you can see here when we change the color transfer function around, it's going through as such too. So, and there's some little color shifts you see along the way. But it's pretty good, like surprisingly good. If you look at things like quantitative numbers, like the RMSE score differences between the images, they're fairly low, but they're not perfect, I would say. And here again, we were arguing proof of concept. Can we do this at all? And we didn't really care if we could. We cared more, what could you do with it when it came up? So let me show you some of the things you can do with it now that we have it. The first is we can actually do a little bit of indication of some kind of user guidance. And the way we do this is by a quantity we call transfer function sensitivity. The way this works is the following. I can take any pixel in the image, and I can always pull that pixel back through the generator, and I can ask the question of, if I change the input, how does that output pixel change? What I'm doing there is I'm actually taking a derivative against the input parameter, by the way. And so if I wiggle around the input space, I can ask how much that wiggles in the output space. And how much that wiggles tells me something about how sensitive that exact pixel is to that position in the transfer function, right? And that derivative is very, very easy to compute with these sorts of neural networks because they're differentiable. Okay, they're not exactly differentiable, they're quasi-differentiable, but they're good enough that we can do the right thing. And we can do this not just for individual pixels, but we now take a norm for a region as well too, and that'll give us some kind of region-based notion of sensitivity. So we said that's an interesting quantity, let's build an interface around it. And here's what the interface looks like. Same sort of opacity transfer function, color transfer function. The blue curve is the opacity transfer function. On the right-hand side, you see we have this sensitivity measure, and you see this pink curve here is showing us sensitivity. The way you should read this plot is it basically says, if sensitivity is high in this region, if I change the transfer function here, I should see a change in the output image here. And this version is global. It basically tells us globally how much the image will change if I update the transfer function there. We can also do this though, as we interact, we can do it in a local way. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually now highlighting this local sensitivity in blocks of pixels, where basically the chunks of the image are going to change if I update the transfer function there. So you'll see in the next little video clip, we'll add a little Gaussian to the transfer function here, and this region of the image is where it's going to change the most. Now we add it in, and you can see that's where the image update is. And as you might imagine, the way opacity works, right? If I have opacity going here, it's actually going to have less sensitivity on the right and more on the left because I'm kind of seeing things on the outside of the volume rather than the inside going in. So you can see as you edit, this will continue to update along the way. So this gives some guidance. It basically tells the user, if you change the transfer function here, you should expect the image to change there. I wouldn't say this is necessarily the best guidance you want, but there's other cool things about it that are interesting. It's view independent, or view dependent rather, in that when I rotate around, we're recomputing all these quantities. And you see here, we can show you where you'll update along the way. So if you have in mind, I want an image to look a certain way, you can do some updates and we'll kind of modulate from there. But it doesn't tell you like, here's something scientifically interesting in the volume. It just tells you how the image is going to change. All right, so I'm going to unpack the network design a little bit more, and I'm going to tell you now what we did with the inputs. So here's the opacity, color transfer function, and the viewpoints. And we essentially vectorize these. So what we do is we use basically a vector of length 256 for each of those. And this is a vector, I think, of length, or a small matrix of length 16, something like that. And we do 1D convolutions and pass them in to our GAN as kind of input along the way. So our generator basically takes that concatenated vector, and that's how it spits out an image. And what's interesting about this is we can now play around with that input space and do some other tricks with neural networks. In particular, what we can do is we can look at that input for the opacity transfer function. We can then think of this as basically this 1D convolution is doing something like a dimensionality reduction. And here what we did was we actually put this in a specific autoencoder where we said, let's map it to a space of 8 dimensions. And then take that 8 dimension space, put it in and feed it in. We can though build on top of that by basically also saying, given an 8-dimensional vector, I can decode and get a transfer function from that. So now what we've really done, if you look at this part of the pipeline to this part of the pipeline, is I built something that takes an opacity transfer function, again, as a 256-dimensional vector, map it to 8, and then I pull it back out to 256. And that means I can now use this as a way to think about the space of opacity transfer functions. In particular, I can take these 8-dimensional vectors and I can project them. What I'm doing here in this plot is I sampled a collection of opacity transfer functions at the 8-dimensional space. So really, I just sampled a bunch of 8-dimensional points and then pulled them through and projected with, this is with DC as a projection. Every point in this space corresponds to a transfer function, and I can always decode it using that decoder network. Right? It also, though, corresponds to an image, with the other parameters being variable, the color transfer function and the camera viewpoint. This gives us a way to represent the space of opacity transfer functions, but it's not, it's a uniform sample in that 8-dimension space. So I wouldn't try to interpret anything in a scatter plot. It's just telling you things projected in a way that I can interact with them. But when I have that, I can interact in lots of different ways. So here you're going to see in the sequence of images, here's the opacity transfer function, and I can build an interface around letting the user pick points in the scatter plot. And as I move around, I can get different opacity transfer functions and different images at the same time. So here's just, we're kind of circling around and moving through that space. So it gives you a way to basically present the user a different way to walk through the space of transfer functions. Rather than having to draw the curve, we can just select points in the scatter. And we can do things here that now give us the second challenge that I talked about. Basically, we can build volume overviews. So here, for example, what we're doing now is I build this grid widget here. And for each cell in the grid widget, I can take something like the average points. And because we're in this 8-dimensional latent space, you can do some kind of interpolation and take averages. It's a little funky from the math side, but it works out okay. And here we're taking basically for each of these, the average opacity transfer function and showing you the volume rendered at the same time. And this we can again do interactively because I don't have to just render one image at a time. I can just batch, push through my network as many images as I want. So here you'll see this interacting. I'm here now adjusting the camera viewpoints, rotating around, and here's showing me that gallery of 16 images as I manipulate that widget along the way. And the blue dot is updating the one in the top right and showing you the exact transfer function at that point. And then you'll see as the video continues, you'll see manipulating with that grid and moving around with this. So it gives the user a way to kind of look at a space of possible things you could see. All right, while that video plays, any questions? It's a neat way to look at this, I would say, but no, the one thing I think that we were a little disappointed with was this scatter plot didn't give you a lot of guidance of like where you should look. It's just giving you an overview to play around with things. But even that overview is already meaningful. For here, for this data set, you see the space of different ways you can look at this volume and kind of manipulate it. Cool. All right. Any questions? This is the end of part 1. So I'm going to talk about a different thing you can do with neural networks next. Sure.
I don't know what to talk about the projection of the you use to have this 2D representation for the green.
So the 2D representation takes the 8-dimensional vector for each transfer function and it projects it to 2D using, I said TSNE, TSNE. Yeah. So I never know if people call it TSNE or TSNE, so I just kind of breeze through it. But you could think to do it with PCA. This was, we said a projection method. It wasn't so much about the specific one going through. And why we tried TSNE is we were trying to see if there was clusters in here. But again, because we uniformly sampled the AP space, it's not clear that you would get clusters in there particularly. And for the experiments we tried, you saw now a couple of different volumes, it really just kind of spreads the points out. That's kind of all you get. Cool. All right, well then maybe I'll move on to the second part of the talk. So what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit about a technique to do compression on volumes using neural representations. Again, it's collaboration with Matt. The work was actually led by his undergraduate student, Brian, and then my PhD student, Kairon, collaborated as well too. I'm going to present it under the framing of compression, but by the end of the talk, I actually want you to think this is a way to represent volumes rather than just a way to compress it. And it's actually pretty interesting and exciting that we can do this. But hopefully I can motivate compression real quickly to everyone. When you have volume data, it's sampled on a grid typically, and we have samples that are basically in the X dimension, the Y dimension, and the Z dimension. We'll store those scalar values as some kind of float or maybe an int somewhere. And we generate lots and lots of these. These can get very complicated in space and in time. And what ends up happening is we generate them, they're too big, we can't put them on our laptops, we can't do viz. So our downstream analysis kind of doesn't scale with them. And so then people try to do compression. And there's 2 problems that we're actually thinking about when we think about compression. The first is, well, it's just too big to fit into memory, which means I can't do my analysis on a commodity machine. I need a supercomputer to do it. The second, though, is an I/O one, which is that I often have to move the data around. So if I make the data smaller, it's easier to move around. Again, with this audience, I'm kind of assuming you get the idea of compression. You've probably encountered this problem already with data sets you're working with. So I feel like I don't have to convince you that maybe we need to do compression. I do like to point out to other people, though, and you probably already saw this little comment, this seems like a big data set. Like you multiply those numbers together, you have lots of samples. This is small. When I talk to folks at the national labs in the US, they want this number to be 4,000 by 4,000 by 4,000, just to compare the numbers. And I've seen data sets that are 10,000 by 10,000, that sort of thing. So this is growing faster than we kind of know what to do. So we can do compression here, and there's kind of 2 forms of compression. There's lossless compression, and lossless compression actually doesn't work all that well. If you want to compress the data and perfectly recover it, you can usually get maybe a factor of 3 or 4, and that's about it, which isn't enough here. So most people then focus on lossy compression, and there's kind of 2 families of that. One is a family of techniques that do transforms. These are things that kind of sample blocks and then compress the blocks individually, or they do things that are data fitting. And in fact, what I'm going to talk about today is the data fitting method. How can I fit a curve? Here, the curve, though, is going to be modeled by a neural network to the data set underneath. And the technique is based on a trick. The trick here is to use a specific type of neural network to do so. This is built on a paper from 2020 that's called SIREN. SIREN stands for activations that are basically using sinusoidal activations. And what we're doing here is it's a particular neural network where at every layer in the neural network, instead of activating with the standard things you might activate like a ReLU or a TANH, we activate with a sinusoid. It sounds kind of silly. Like, why is that such a, one little simple trick? Why does that make it work? But here's a demo from their paper. And what they're doing here is they're literally just training to reproduce this ground truth image and the gradients and a Laplacian. And you see here they're training against ReLUs, TANH, a couple other different activations. And then the one on the right is the siren cell network. And what they end up doing is they converge faster with the sinusoidal network, and they get the gradients right, and they get the Laplacian. So the second derivative of the image right. If you compare each of these activations, they do okay on the gradients, but if you look at the second derivatives, the TANH is maybe the one that does the second best relative to the ground truth. And the activations here basically work well if you're thinking about your data as having continuous derivatives. So most people in computer vision, they're happy with ReLUs and TANHs. These are discontinuous functions because they're using photographs. They're using images from the real world, which are discontinuous. If I take a photograph of this beautiful scene out there, it isn't a scalar field, right? There's buildings in front of things, there's foregrounds and backgrounds. So you want to capture discontinuities. For scientific data though, you actually don't want to capture discontinuities because you're modeling it typically as a continuous function. And that's kind of the magic of how this works. Literally, we're building a neural network with these sinusoidal activations. And because we assume that we're working with scientific simulations, we can start to say, well, maybe there's some level of continuity. And these periodic activations, the sinusoid, you can infinitely differentiate. The derivative of sine is a cosine, the derivative of cosine is another sine, and you can keep going and get C infinity continuity. I'm hiding some tricks. There's some really careful things that we do with initialization that make this work. But when this paper came out, if you go to their website and take a look at it, they show it works for the image demo that I just showed you. They use sound, they do Poisson equations, they do physical simulations, and they show all these different types of data domains. This style network works really well. So how does this network look? It's actually super easy to explain. I can explain it in 2 slides. This network takes as input X, Y, and Z, and it spits out f of X, Y, and Z. It literally is you would call this a coordinate-based MLP, multi-layer perceptron. And all we're doing is we go from X, Y, and Z, we go through a collection of layers, and each of those layers get activated by a sinusoid. So there are some residual connections that we put in there, which do improve the network. But even the basic network without the residual connections works well. And what we do is we train it to basically optimize the difference between what our function predicts for a given point and what the grid had at the input data going through. So that builds this coordinate-based representation, and we can use this to basically capture the volume data set. This becomes an oracle, essentially, that given XYZ spits out f of XYZ. There's some cool parts about that oracle. It's conceptually very simple, and what it's doing is it's basically directly representing the function rather than representing a sample of the function. What that means is that we can interpolate at any point. I don't have to give it X, Y, and Z from a grid sample. I can give it some X, Y, and Z somewhere in the middle. And it will actually give you a fairly nice interpolate because it's interpolating using basically sinusoidal activations. You can think about this kind of like wavelets, right? We're adding a collection of sines all together. So we can get random access evaluation because we can differentiate the network. We can get the gradients for free as well too. Given X, Y, Z, I can spit out the gradient of f, X, Y, and Z and whatever derivatives you want from there. That's literally the machinery of this paper, by the way. Like it's just as simple as that. What I haven't told you yet though is I haven't told you, well, how do I make compression out of this? Well, compression boils down to the following. My network that I build replaces my volume data set. If the network is smaller than the volume, I've compressed it. And what that means is basically the number of weights that I use at each of these layers are basically my representation of the function. If I use fewer weights, I get a smaller compression. If I use fewer layers, I get a smaller compression. So our network is basically parameterized by number of layers you want and then number of weights that you have along there. And you set that as input and you can dictate how much compression you get out of it. We do a little bit of extra work to really kind of squeeze as much compression out of this. So in particular, we quantize the weight space so that you're not using the full floating point space. You can use kind of lower spaces and you can use more sparse activations. So you can zero out some of the activations as well too and really compress it a little bit more. But the basic idea of just how many layers equals compression is really all you kind of need to get most of the bang for the buck. The neat part is it works extremely well. So here's some examples. Again, projector's not going to do such a great job of showing you the images, Here we're looking at the original volumes, and I'm listing their size in megabytes. So here's 512 megabytes, 141 megabytes, and then here's our compression technique going through. I'm showing it to you in two ways. The first number that's on the top row is the decimals. Here, this you can think about as compression ratio. Higher is better, so more decibels is better, basically signal to noise ratio. And here's a compression ratio. These are compression ratios of 1 to 200 to 1. So we've reduced the size of the data from 100 megabytes to 1 to 2 megabytes, basically. Here's a slightly more extreme compression. Here we're going down to 600 or 700 to 1. And so we're compressing to like less than 1 megabyte, a couple hundred kilobytes, that sort of thing. And we're achieving still pretty high decibel ratios. Again, this is an average of all pixels, but we're doing pretty well. Here's a little bit more of a comparison directly, so you can see it a little bit better. Original volume, this 512 megabyte volume is compressed to less than a megabyte with about a 45 decibel compression. And it's pretty good, although here it's probably zoomed in enough that you can see there are some artifacts. You can see some extra noise kind of in the image coming through. Question? Yeah, of course.
How would you characterize that noise that you observe here in the corner? Is that a small variations of sinusoids, or?
Yeah, it's something like that. And I think in this particular volume, we didn't put any guidance on compressing and also satisfying derivative constraint on the loss function. We can bake that in, and then it does even a little bit better here. But there's some kind of high frequency oscillation that's happening there. Yeah, but again, I would call this a pretty extreme amount of compression. This is not like a volume that's all zeros everywhere. This is a turbulent, noisy volume everywhere, and you kind of need all the data points. And we basically threw away 511 megabytes and still did pretty well. This is only doing it numerically though, so I think it's helpful to ask like, what's a good baseline here? So what we did was we compared against T-Thresh. T-Thresh had come out a year or two before this paper came out, and T-Thresh in their paper basically compared against 10 different compression techniques. Maybe it's not 10, but around 10. And basically T-Thresh was better than all of them. So what I'm going to show you in these curves is we're basically better than T-Thresh, which means we're also better than all these other compression techniques like ZFP and things like that. So here's how you should read these curves. Compression ratios on the x-axis, PSNR or qualities on the y-axis. Again, higher is better here, and higher is better is more compression. And T-Thresh's curve basically for an equal amount of preservation gets less compression than us. So here they're compressing about 300, we're compressing about 600. Or for an equal compression ratio, their decibels are lower than ours. And we more or less are doing better than T-Thresh in all volumes, except for small amounts of compression. So right over here, you can see a couple crossings of this curve going through. So we kind of do better the more you compress. That's kind of how you think about this. Pretty cool. Like I have to admit, I have a very good relationship with the author of T-Thresh, or one of the authors of T-Thresh. And I wasn't quite sure what they would think when we showed them this paper. And I was kind of happy that they were excited about this being a new compression technique too. But that author has spent many, many years thinking about compression. So that's Peter Lindstrom. So to do better than that is pretty cool. Like it's kind of, I don't know, something we're kind of proud of, I would say. Here's some direct image comparisons. I think PSNR kind of hides a lot of things, by the way. It shows you just a single number. It doesn't show you what happened in the features. It's hard to see on the projector, but you can see some comparisons of basically neural comp to T-Thresh, kind of top to bottom here, kind of comparing the preservation here. And you see where T-Thresh starts to break down is it actually has a poor job of actually capturing all the normals. So as a result, some of the surfaces kind of deteriorate a little bit along the way. This image might be a little bit easier to see. This is doing extreme compression. I would say if you're at a PSNR of 40 or below, you've actually lost a lot of interesting information. By the way, like if you start to read Viz papers when they report compression techniques, a lot of papers are like, yeah, we got a PSNR of 25. That's actually not that good. Like I think here you may lose a lot of information even at something like 40. But we're kind of comparing how much compression you can do. And here we're getting like 2000 to 1 type compression, which is pretty extreme. And it's still a pretty good manifestation. By comparison, at T-Thresh, it's about a factor of 2 difference between the two. I mentioned normals, because Julian asked about them. Normals are really easy to preserve as well. If you want to target gradient preservation, you can basically just add a regularizer into this, which is saying preserve the gradient of the function, and there's the little prime next to the x at the gradient as you would compute here. What do I mean by gradient for the sample volume? This is doing like finite differences and computing an approximation of the gradient there. And we set a regularizer term and played around with it. 0.05 worked pretty well for us. And you can see comparing the ground truth, no gradient regularization, you see those sort of waves and bumps. And that does a pretty good job of kind of smoothing out the surfaces. So it works pretty well, is the kind of take. It works in some sense better than I expected, although at this point, I should maybe not be so surprised that neural networks do so well on things. And here's some comparison of our work again with T-Thresh and their gradient preservation. Here you really see that kind of speckling and noise and stuff. So at this point, you should probably ask, well, is there anything bad about this algorithm? And there are a couple places where I think there's some pretty severe limitations. It's a neural network, so it takes time to train. These times, though, this is basically reported in seconds. And here we're reporting in thousands of seconds. So in the end, to do compression, it takes maybe an hour for the volumes we were working with. There's an interesting relationship here, though. It actually takes more time to do less compression. And the reason why is when we do less compression, it means we have a bigger network. So it takes more time to optimize the weights. So if you want to compress even more, it's actually cheaper, which is kind of counterintuitive, but it's a neat kind of takeaway from there. And again, I think this is reasonable, if you're working the volume to compress in an hour. But if you compare it to something like T-Thresh, I mean, they compress in seconds. So we're nowhere near most of the standard compression techniques, but we're fitting a very complex function to complex data.
I guess T-Thresh has a different application set up in mind where they want to save to this immediately.
Exactly. And so here you can think, well, if you're spending a lot of time like running a simulation, you're maybe okay spending 1 more hour doing compression so you could drop it. And like maybe there's a reasonable trade-off for that time budget to be okay. I argue though that like just building these neural representations is also interesting for other things, but then requires you to shift them around and do different things with them. So if I have a volume and I want to now a neural volume and I want to load it in ParaView, how do I volume render it? I can random access the volume, but ParaView is expecting gridded data basically. So I would actually then have to convert it back to gridded data. So pros and cons there. This doesn't work well for all types of volumes. It worked really, really well for simulation data, but in our experiments, it didn't work nearly as well for medical images, where medical images have this kind of structured scanner noise in there. So you can see here, this is actually a pretty low PSNR 35 and only a 25:1 compression ratio. So these things are in fact data dependent because effectively what we're asking is, can I fit this sort of sinusoidal model? If the data doesn't have that characteristic, it won't always work. And medical images are one sort of example where that might not be the best thing. All right, that's more or less my talk. I'll wrap up a little bit. I think there's lots of cool ideas to do machine learning here and use it in scientific visualization for representing volumes and doing all sorts of different proxies of things. The work that we're continuing to work on now is basically saying, what would be the right set of primitives that if you wanted to replace the full viz pipeline with volumes that are neural based, what sort of primitives could you do without having to convert back to grids and things like that? Lots of interesting questions there. What we're really doing though is we're generating surrogates for the volume. So if you see this word surrogate, you should think about it as some kind of proxy representation. And that's exactly what we're doing here. There's lots of neat opportunities too with bigger data sets, ensembles, time varying volumes, so on. I'll quickly wrap up with just some acknowledgements. So again, I'll thank my co-authors, Jishin, Brian, Kairong, and Matt. All this work is available online. They were published in PDCG and Euroviz, but you can find the papers on arXiv if you want to take a look at them now. And all the code, Matt has been gracious to host on his GitHub, so you can check it out there. The work's been supported by the National Science Foundation, and Julian mentioned as well the Department of Energy. So I've had lots of good sponsors for this work. So thanks a lot for listening. I'm happy to take any other questions.
Do we have more questions from the audience?
So
Sure.
My first tricky question, it's for when you compress the volume, you give the free coordinates as inputs and the outputs you try to predict the scalar value.
Yeah.
And do you think it could be a way to use like a notion of locality to not only give I don't know how to put this, but not only give a pair of free coordinates and scalar value, but to give like convolution, I think it cannot be used here because you're not working in the direction of the volume. It could be a way. Is there a way to use this notion of locality like convolution?
Yeah. I mean, you could think instead of just vectorizing X, Y, Z, maybe you vectorize X, Y, Z and like the 10 nearest neighbors, and you pass in that way. You could do something like that. I'm not sure it would condition the network to be that much better. I think the better route for that still looks like this, where you're conditioning on the gradient or the second derivative if you really want some kind of locality. But I don't know. I haven't tried it, so I couldn't do it there, or I can't really speak to it directly. I can tell you one thing though, that the graphics community has been starting to do with these sorts of implicit neural representations, or now they call them coordinate-based MLPs. By the way, if you look at graphics literature in the last 2 years, there's tons of papers that are using techniques like this. And what they're doing to localize the network is instead of building one big network for a volume, they build something like an octree. And then at each leaf of the octree, they solve a very small MLP. And those things interact with each other, and they have some work to kind of make it seamless and things like that. So it's a different form of locality, and it makes the network training that much easier because you're only training on a small region of the volume. So it's kind of similar in spirit to what you asked, but maybe flipping it around and merging it a little bit. And I think those are probably the ways to go, especially if you want to achieve compression. If I build lots of tiny MLPs rather than one big one, I actually can do even more compression, it looks like. Yeah. So it's actually combining something block-based with something, MLP-based. Yeah, sure. Oh yeah, that's very, very straightforward to do, except for the following issue, which is how much more complex does this network have to be if I pass an XYZT? So we don't have a good answer to that question, but I think it's conceptually very, very simple to do. There's no reason why I couldn't add in a fourth or fifth. If I had a parameter space, maybe I have 3 or 4 different parameters. So I have X, Y, Z, and then S1, S2, S3. I think that's very, very straightforward to do. How much it compresses versus how much it accurately represents, I think is kind of the interesting question to take here. For us, it seems like in volumes it works really, really well. And I anticipate it would look pretty well for time varying data, assuming some level of continuity. So there's another issue here you have to think a little bit carefully about, which is we kind of made an implicit assumption that the volume was sampled densely so that there was some continuity in XYZ positions. If I give it only a sparse set of samples, it's going to fit something that could be quite high error. When you have time varying volumes, you often don't have the same time resolution. It's hard to reconcile. What does sampled densely in time mean versus sampled densely in space? You could make an argument on the temporal derivatives and something like that. A lot of time varying volumes that we all have access to are actually dense in space and sparse in time. So that might make the network do a worse job because of that too.
So in that case, what you train a different network.
That would be the other option, is to train a network at each time step, or train a network for the first time step, and then use that as the initialization for the network for the next time step. So there's a couple of different schemes you could do just like that with. And likewise, there's very little constraints on the output. There's no reason this needs to be a scalar. You could train a tensor field if you wanted as well too. That sort of thing. Yeah. Again, in principle, there's no constraints. I'm not making a grand claim that this will work for all types of fields. It works for scalar fields though, so we'll start with that. Yeah. Yeah.
Time series, and it's used to generate some permanent text or text, some sequence, and maybe you can use it, train it, and you can use it to generate sequences of volumes, compress the initial time sequence of volume that you have.
I think this is an interesting idea. So the proposals use a technique called recurrent neural networks here. And recurrent neural networks often think about things in sequence. And I think that fits into the mode of, if I want to predict the next time step from the current time step, I would use something like a recurrent neural network. It might be tricky to train though. So I think there's some trade-off there. I don't know if it's better to do it as XYZT or to do something that's more recurrent. I think that's an interesting problem to look into actually. So it's a good idea.
And so you use the style activation functions.
Yeah, literally the input of each layer is the output of applying the weights of the matrix times X plus some offset, take the sine of it, and then that's fed into the next layer.
And then you try with other activation functions.
We didn't try, but I would not expect it to be good. Yeah, I would expect it to do exactly what did happen here. Yeah. So, or it might be good, but you might have to tune it more carefully. It might take more work, or you might need more weights or more layers, things like that. The intriguing part of this is how simple the architecture is. And like, I don't know, on this next slide, I say, oh, I think there's a delay in my, I basically say that I think it's magic. I don't quite think it's magic anymore, but I think it's pretty close to magic. Pierre, I saw you raise your hand. What kind of? Yeah, this was all trained on a single GPU. I think the training we did was on, it was probably a V100 that we have access to. And we're just using PyTorch, things like that to do it. So nothing fancy.
Okay, so the particular data is dark, and do you think they can use a
Yeah, so I think if we were going to do that, we'd go back to the earlier idea of training training a volume under partitions on an octree and then train each piece separately. I think that would be the right way to start with that. It's interesting. So what we didn't really test here is like how big of a volume versus how small. So if you're really picking apart my talk, which I don't think you are, but I think an author could, we didn't actually compress very, very large volumes. We compressed volumes that were, a few hundred megabytes or maybe 1 gigabyte. If you're compressing a volume that's 1 terabyte, I think you do probably have to cut it up into pieces and do something block-based. A single GPU wouldn't be able to handle all that, or it might, but it would take a very, very long time to do that. Things like that. Yeah.
When you generate your data set, you make the next environment where you don't have the GPU, so you're ready to move the data from one specific to another GPU.
Yeah, in a full in situ setting, what you're describing is very well might be the case that all the compute resources on that node are already used for simulation, and then you have to feed it around. I actually think though that there's a middle ground here that's another interesting take. A lot of simulations now are doing what are called PINNs, physics informed neural networks. So I actually think those neural networks are already being spat out from some of the newest simulations. That's not, not every single physics and PDE solver has adapted to that, but people are already starting to experiment with that now. And I think it kind of fits in the same family of, oh, well, I have a neural network already, and then maybe I could do some extra work with the simulation to spit out the compressed form of the network right there. But you're right, if I have to train and I need a GPU, and I'm using a GPU heavy simulation code, I'm gonna have to move it to the Viz server and go from there. Maybe there's a way to stream it though, and stream samples. What we were kind of doing here was proof of concept in the sense of showing that you could do a compression this way. But there's a lot of work on like, how would you actually feed it into a real system? Yeah. Great. Other questions? How about you, Otis? Do you have a question? No.
Maybe
Oh, yeah. Sure.
So when you do video compression, image compression, you start doing the Fourier transform or Fourier transform. Do you do anything like this? Take the whole data.
It's not like converting it into a frequency space in the same way. The authors of this paper, they experiment a little bit with time varying data as well too, and doing compression there. I think conceptually though, it starts to look similar to things like, not exactly a Fourier transform, but things like wavelets, where you're actually accommodating signals of various things at various levels. Oh, I need to not click onto this slide because it goes into this 15-second video. Let me switch to the next. So you could argue that each of these layers going through, because they're doing a sinusoid, is basically one frequency band. Yeah, because you're doing sines of sines of sines of sines. Yeah, exactly. But I don't want to make too strong a claim there. I don't think it's equivalent to like a Fourier decomposition. It just seems very similar to one, I would say.
Maybe if you start with the presence space, maybe you can use something which is not the same distribution concept, but it's simple.
Oh, so that's interesting. So maybe you could do like even just a linear activation or something like that. That's the base on there. That's an interesting idea. You'd have to pay the price of doing your Fourier decomposition first, but that shouldn't be so expensive to do. Yeah. Oh, there are compression techniques that do build on the Fourier space or build on a wavelet type compression. That would be the other ones that are like that. Yeah, I haven't thought of it. It's an interesting idea. Although I guess if you're compressing the frequency signal, you still actually might want to do sinusoidal activation, just because that you're also thinking maybe is some continuous function just on a different domain. Yeah. Yeah, I haven't thought too deeply about it, but I do tend to believe, like many convolutional neural networks, that you have finer and finer detail as you kind of move through the network in the same way, or coarser and coarser detail, I guess, because you're adding up features along the way. So. Great. Well, thanks again for listening. I hope you enjoyed the talk.
I don't have more questions. I guess we can thank Josh again.
I'm looking forward to hearing about all the things that you all are working on. So it's gonna be a fun afternoon. Yes, Otis. Did you make me a drawing? Oh, do we want this on video?